Hi, I'm Adam Erby. I'm Curator of Fine and Decorative Arts here at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and I'd like to welcome you to Mansion Mondays. I've come in today and maintaining social distancing, I'm giving a little bit of a tour of the Central Passage so that people can enjoy Mount Vernon while we are closed to the public, but we want you to see Mount Vernon during this really beautiful time of year. So I've been asked by my colleagues to announce at the very beginning of this presentation that through the generous support of the Hamill family from Arizona, we're giving away a family membership to Mount Vernon each day this week. To enter to win, just leave us a comment during our Facebook live stream and we'll pick the winner by the end of each day. So I want to get started and talk a little bit about the Central Passage as a space and its relationship to the other rooms here, the 4 rooms in the hall, in the Central Passage, and how this really functioned in the mansion. So during George Washington, the end of George Washington's lifetime, the front door really was the door that you see back here, the door on the mansion circle. That's where virtually all guests would have arrived here to the mansion. They would have been received by Frank Lee, the enslaved butler, and brought here into the passage, where there were 14 chairs set up, 14 mahogany chairs set up, and likely all of the doors around the room would have been shut at that point. If they were of an equal social status to George Washington, they would have been invited into the parlor. But if not, Washington would have met them here, done his business with them, and they would have gone on their way. So this is one of the only spaces that many people ever saw that belonged to George Washington. So really the iconography of this room, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is really important. Central passages in the 18th century, they feel like large hallways to us today, but they are really critical spaces socially in the 18th century. What's really important about them in Virginia, particularly when it's really warm, is heat. Most central passages have a door on either side that opens them up for wonderful cross breezes. So if you're out here in the passage during the summer, this would have been one of the coolest places in the house. Also, as I stated, there's a social mediation function, and it also provided a living space for the Washingtons. We have one account from George Washington that he actually used this space during the summer. Socially, the family would enjoy this space. And in other Virginia houses, you see lots of different people using these spaces in probate inventories, which are inventories taken after the person passed away. In some of these houses, you even see a bed set up in the summer, so you could take advantage of that wonderful cross breeze during the year. A central passage is a very common form in an 18th century Virginia house. You often see them running through the house, and in the most simple form of a Virginia house, you have a central passage with a hall and a parlor on either side. And so that was the space that people came in and got prepared to go into the additional spaces. Now, here at Mount Vernon, this particular space was built in 1734 by George Washington's father. And it's part of the original portion of the mansion that was later expanded by George Washington. But pretty much everything you see here represents work done by Washington and the enslaved and hired carpenters here at Mount Vernon, particularly the woodwork that you see around you. Washington inherits, he takes a lifetime lease on the property in the early 1750s, and by 1757, he begins work renovating the mansion. That's when he takes the mansion to 2 full stories in height, and he redoes all of the interiors. He puts in this magnificent woodwork in that 1757 to 1759 period, and he's really tying into the many classical books that are available at the time with drawings of called pattern books coming from England that show the particular patterns that you can use drawn from classical Roman architecture. And you see wonderful pediments above doorways all around the room, really in that classical tradition. You also see this wonderful staircase behind me. That Washington puts in using walnut that comes from Ohio. It's a really incredible staircase, and this is still the staircase that we use in the mansion today with these wonderful turned balusters. So it's a really important aspect, and it was a show of wealth and status to have such a large, magnificent staircase to go up to the second floor. Now, the central passage, again, is really critical for the iconography that you see in here. The Washington was very careful to choose the different aspects of the artwork that you see in the room. In the early period, in the sort of 1757 to 59 period, in 59, Washington writes to London to order a number of busts to go above the pediments in each of the doorways. He writes to London, and he unfortunately does not receive the ones he's looking for, which are largely famous generals that he really wants to put above the doorways and show his knowledge of these famous people throughout the world, and also his level of education. He writes to London, and as often happens in London, he wasn't able to get exactly what he wanted, so his agent went out and bought for him some additional busts that we don't know if Washington ever actually used, with the exception of two. There are two small sculptures of lions, the Medici lions, that are famous from the Renaissance, that were sent to Washington in that particular order, and Washington put them above the door to the back here, and they will return when we renovate, when we do the next restoration of this the central passage. So that's the early period, and that's about what we know for the decoration during that period. When Washington comes back from the presidency, like so many other spaces in the mansion, Washington completely redoes the central passage. At that point, we know he added wallpaper, which would have gone from down here on the white plaster that you see behind you, goes up to the second floor. He added wallpaper, but he also brought back a number of pieces of artwork to use in the house, and artwork and objects. The most important of these objects is one of our most important pieces we have in the collection today, and that's the key to the Bastille, which we see right here. This is sent to George Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette in 1790 as a gift. The Marquis de Lafayette sends it along with a watercolor. The watercolor, this is a replica of the watercolor that you see below. He says that this watercolor represents the Bastille as it appeared immediately after he ordered its destruction. And so you see little figures here on the top of the Bastille who are throwing off pieces of the Bastille, bits of the stone, and they're tearing down the building. Lafayette calls the key to the Bastille the key to the fort of despotism, and he says he's sending it as a son to an adopted father, and also as a deputy to his general. So over the past few years, we've done a lot of work on this particular piece. It is one of the things that stayed with Mount Vernon really throughout its history. It was put on this wall in 1797. It had previously been in the presidential residence in Philadelphia. And it has this wonderful case that George Washington had made for it in Philadelphia by a carver by the name of James Reynolds. This is the original case. It has always held the Bastille key, and we're very glad that we have it. When people come here in the 19th century, they see the key to the Bastille, and that's the one object they report on the most. But the case is pretty much all original, but it has been over several centuries, it's aged and sort of become a little bit worn. And so about 2 years ago, we did some major conservation work to this particular piece. We figured out what the paint color was on the interior. We put an isolating layer. Our wonderful conservator, Tom Snyder in Williamsburg, put an isolating layer over the top and regilded the piece. But we were also missing an element of the carving, this little bit at the bottom, we were missing that particular piece, and we worked with a carver in Pennsylvania named Robert McCullough, and Robert figured out what the little missing piece was. We had two little nubs that you could see, and in the 19th century, the piece that existed, we were able to conserve it and bring it back to more of the way it appeared during George Washington's lifetime. At that same point, when we were working on that particular project, we were also working on the paint in the room. And the paint is a major change you might recognize if you've been to Mount Vernon in the last sort of 15 or 20 years. We've gone to this cream or stone color that was very popular in the 18th century. And this is a color that we found based on extensive paint analysis we did in the room. What you might remember beforehand is that we had a faux grained surface on the surface of the wood, and that particular wood graining is something that we was found in early paint analysis done in the early 1980s. And so since the 1980s, paint analysis and paint techniques have really been studied more intensely. We have better microscopes to see more layers of paint. So when our paint analyst was able to look at the paint in this space, she was able to see far more layers than they were in 1980, and see that there were multiple layers of this cream colored paint, which is likely what Washington had in this room. One space, so it was this wonderful cream or stone color is what they would have called it. And it's to imitate the stone of antiquities, those wonderful stone buildings that you see in ancient Greece and Rome. So to go with that, Washington, in coming back from the presidency, brings wallpaper back. And the wallpaper went from down here on the plaster work, on the white plaster you see, all the way upstairs. It was not on the woodwork that you see. In the late 19th century, our resident superintendent, Harrison Dodge, found little fragments of this paper. And it's really intriguing what he found, and they still survive in our archives. He found one little curlicue that is particularly evocative and particularly associated with a type of pattern called an arabesque. And arabesques are taken from ancient Roman wall paintings. And they look very much like they're long rows of flowers and baskets and little Roman figures that go between them. So that little curlicue, which is on a piece that's about 3 inches wide, gave us evidence as to what the wallpaper was. We have worked extensively over the past 3 years to figure out what that wallpaper pattern might have been. And we actually identified a wallpaper that was sold to another person by the same retailer that sold Washington wallpaper, and it's a wonderful arabesque that closely relates to our surviving fragment. So in the next few months, next 6 months, hopefully, when things get back up and running, we'll be able to install that wallpaper going up to the second floor, and it will transform the space in a really wonderful way, brighten it up, and it'll have that real 1790s appearance that you would have expected to see. At this point, I want to ask if anyone has questions. Please feel free to write them in the comments at the bottom, and I'm looking forward to answering a few of those in just a few minutes. I also want to talk about some other artwork in the room. This particular print that we see here is a print of George Washington at the Battle of Trenton. This piece is a period copy of the Washington original. The original painting was done by John Trumbull of Washington at the Battle of Trenton for the city of Charleston. And it showed Washington in this very militaristic pose, and at Trenton. In the city of Charleston received the painting, and they didn't quite like it. I think it was probably because it was a scene in New Jersey, not a scene in South Carolina, and they said that they wanted something a little bit less dramatic. So that piece comes back and is now owned by Yale University Art Gallery, and Charleston gets another copy that has a view of Charleston in the background. But this particular print is taken from that original scene done for done for the city of Charleston. And it's a really magnificent view of Washington at one of his most important battles during the American Revolution. Washington, after he's crossed the Delaware, goes on to fight to attack the Hessians at Trenton, to win there, and it's one of the big victories in 1776 that really leads to a boost in morale for the Americans. Trumbull is one of Washington's aides de camp during the American Revolution, and he decides after the American Revolution that he's going to do first a series of paintings of George Washington, but also a series of paintings on scenes from the American Revolution. And you may recognize many of these because many of these ended up being used in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. There are 4 of them in there. Trumbull did this particular print from that large-scale painting. He had it engraved in London and sent to George Washington in 1796, 1797. It's issued in 1796. And people ask about prints in the 18th century, and prints today might mean something less expensive or not quite as elite as a painting. But in the 18th century, prints were incredibly important artistic productions in and of themselves. It took a tremendous amount of skill to use a copper plate and engrave in it every little line that you see in this. And so in some cases, in this particular case, Thomas Cheeseman, who did the engraving, was almost as famous as John Trumbull himself. So a very important technique in the 18th century. Now, this particular example sitting in front of us is a replica of Washington's original that's at Tudor Place. Tudor Place belonged to Martha Washington's granddaughter, Martha Parke Custis Peter, and her husband, Thomas Peter. And when Martha Washington passed away in 1802, she specifically gave in her will this print by Trumbull to Martha Parke Custis Peter as a bequest. And it survives in this wonderful frame. And you can see the original on view actually at Tudor Place when everything opens back up. So we have a replica here today of that original one. And you can see just how important that piece was to Martha Washington and to the grandchildren. One other particularly interesting piece to point out is this wonderful lantern. The lantern is about 1760, English, probably London made, and it is japanned metal, so it's sort of a lacquered painted metal. And this piece has a long and storied history. Washington buys it for the space in 1760, but later on in the 19th century, in 1802, George Washington Parke Custis, Martha's grandson, got this piece and took it to Arlington House, his own home, where Arlington National Cemetery is today. He took it there and used it in his own central passage. So while it might feel like it's a piece that's been with Mount Vernon forever, there is this sort of intermediate period where it went to the grandson's home. George Washington Parke Custis owned all the family portraits. So this illuminated the family portraits that were hung in his central passage. And then this piece got a storied history by George Washington Parke Custis. And I'm not exactly sure how this story occurred, but you often see this in the 19th century, that people remember things in a little bit different way. George Washington Parke Custis and later his daughter and granddaughter recalled that this piece was a gift to George Washington to Lawrence Washington, actually, from Admiral Vernon, after whom Mount Vernon is named. So all the early publications talk about this really important icon and relic. But we were able to find today, recently, in the past 10 years, the invoice for it. We know exactly when George Washington bought it. And then in 1908, during the Civil War, this piece was actually confiscated from Arlington House by the federal government, taken to the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C., and it wasn't given back to the Lee family until the very late 19th century. At that point, Mary Custis Lee, who is a Custis descendant, she has the piece, and in 1908, she brought it back and gave it as a gift to Mount Vernon So it's a really wonderful and iconic object. And when you sort of start to pick out the pieces, you can tell a whole biography of an object in a really wonderful way about really basically any object in the room. We have a number of additional prints in the space. These are all classical scenes that they're replicas of ones Washington brought back in 1797 from Philadelphia. So when you're at Mount Vernon, you've got this layer, this evolution of history. But you also have to remember that in the last few years of Washington's life, he changed the spaces tremendously. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the spaces that open up off of the central passage. The two most important of those spaces are the dining room, the green, which is this magnificent green color, and the parlor, which is across the way. And I'll talk for a second about the dining room. In the 18th century, the two most important entertaining spaces in a gentry level house were the dining room and the parlor. And they were sort of masculine and feminine oriented spaces. The man of the house presided over the dining table. And so when you see probate inventories of dining rooms, you often see that the artwork on the wall is very masculine in orientation. So you see in this particular dining room, we have a number of Washington's friends, whether they be scientists like Benjamin Rittenhouse or generals like the Marquis de Lafayette. But you also see a scene of war, the death of General Wolfe, a famous battle from the end during the French and Indian War. So these are the types of scenes that you see in these dining rooms. The ladies, the more feminine oriented space was the parlor, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The parlor was often where the ladies retired after the tablecloth was taken off after the meal. The men continued to have drinks in the dining room while the ladies retired to the parlor. So the parlor here, which we have recently restored, is really Martha Washington's space. And you see in here, Martha showing off her family. You see all of the wonderful portraits of the Washington family. Many of these are replicas of the originals, all of the wonderful family portraits that Martha really commissioned over the course of her life from 1757, when she first commissions John Wollaston to paint her first husband, and her two children, and 1796, when you have the wonderful portraits, the miniature portraits, smaller portraits by James Sharples. So at this point, if we want to take some questions.
Yeah, Adam, we have from Palm Beach, the key to the Bastille, is it an original, and how many are in existence that we know of?
That's a great question. The key to the Bastille is an original key to the Bastille. It's the main key to the Bastille, and there are a number of keys to. You can imagine this is a prison. There are lots of keys to the Bastille, and they are passed out over time by different people, by different relic hunters. There are a number in France. There's another one in Alexandria that the Marquis de Lafayette gives to the local Masonic group in Alexandria when he comes back in 1824, 1825. So yes, ours is the original, and according to the Marquis de Lafayette, it is the main key to the fort. So presumably the front gate.
And Adam, the question, is there a dumbwaiter in here between two doors?
There's a dumbwaiter. I think you're thinking about Monticello with the dumbwaiter question. So Monticello actually does have dumbwaiters, but here at Mount Vernon, we don't have anything like that. What we have that's sort of similar to that is we have the Butler's pantry, or Butler's closet, which is on the other side of the dining room. And that's where the enslaved butler, Frank Lee, would have plated meals with two enslaved valets, and they would have served in the dining room. So that's our closest equivalent that we have. So that's for the dining room, but for when meals are taking place in the other space in the new room, probably one of either the little parlor you see there's one account of in the late 18th century of using another space to set up for a meal, so you could plate and move on that way. But not quite sure.
And a follow-up to that, what's your favorite find at Mount Vernon?
What's my favorite find at Mount Vernon? There's one favorite find that is came very early on when I came to Mount Vernon. That was this account book that was kept by the Fairfax family at Belvoir, George and Martha Washington's best friends and next door neighbors. And this account book contained 4 pages of furniture that the Fairfaxes, 4 pages of listings, very detailed listings of furnishings that the Fairfaxes bought in 1763. They brought it back to Mount Vernon to Belvoir and furnished their house with it. And then in 1773, they go back to England, and in 1774, Washington presides over an auction of the furniture, and he ends up with a tremendous amount of it. But he's given a suite of furniture, including the furniture in the front parlor, which we weren't able to really figure out until this document showed up in 2013. That was the most fun.
So Adam, a keen observer has noticed that there is a cubby underneath the stairs. Are there other storage places like that here in the house?
There are little nooks and crannies in various places in the house. Yes, there's a wonderful little nook and cranny there. And actually in the Washington's probate inventory, there's a listing of the objects that are in there, including a boot scraper and a fire screen. But in the study, there's a wonderful closet where George Washington presumably kept his clothing throughout the time the study existed. It has its original paint and its original shelving. It's one of the best preserved spaces here at Mount Vernon. And then on the 3rd floor, there are some spaces, they're called lumber rooms, that are on the extreme ends, the 2 additions. Those are really wonderful, wonderful spaces, and they would have been mainly for storage. And you have things listed in there in the probate inventory too.
So Adam, I think you talked a little bit about this, but does all the artwork in this room date back to Washington?
So that's a very good question. Everything, we don't have all the Washington originals in these spaces, but we do have great listings of what Washington had. And in some instances, we do have 1 or 2 of the original pieces. All of the artwork in the room right now is either an original or a replica of a period piece that is the same edition of the print that George Washington owned. So yes, they're all exactly like what Washington would have had. So we have, but everything certainly does. The materials date to the period. Sometimes they're reproductions, and sometimes they are the original pieces, and sometimes they're period duplicates, is what we call them.
So Adam, Joy would like to know how much of the original staircase is still there, or has it been replaced?
So that's a very good question, and one I will defer to my architecture colleagues on for the most part, other than to say that that the vast majority of it is original to my understanding of it. It's a remarkable survival, and you have to remember that when we're in a normal operation, 1 million people a year go up the staircase, and this is the original staircase. The handrail is the one that Washington touched. So it is one of our really most remarkable surviving artifacts. In the late 19th century, there was a little bit of sagging in the staircase, but given some sort of structural insecurities that were inherent during George Washington's lifetime. But then with all the people coming up, it sort of settled a little bit. And they put in some steel I-beams to hold up the staircase, and those have been in place since the late 1890s, and they've been holding it up to this day. I mean, even most of the original treads are still here, which is really remarkable.
Why were the stairs were very small in width?
So I don't know. I think they're about like an average stair, but who knows? I mean, my foot I wear a size, say, 11, and it sort of goes over the edge a little bit, but yeah, I've never thought about that. That's a good question.
David would like to know, he's from Lexington, Kentucky. During a visit, he learned that most of the paintings are originals. How do you preserve them with the mansion open to the outside elements?
That's a very good question. So lots of the paintings in here are original. Some are. There's a mix in the house because other institutions own a lot of the original paintings. But the way we preserve them is oftentimes we do careful conservation work on these particular paintings and have professional art painting conservators look at these individual paintings, make sure they're in good structural condition, and we do regular checks on them. In the new room in particular, we've put optium glazing in front of the paintings, which is a really high-tech plexiglass that's sort of anti-glare and anti-UV, so you can't. So it sort of protects the surface level of the painting, and there's a spacer behind it. So we're protecting them as best we can in these particular conditions. But we have them; they're pretty well when they're under optium. They're fairly well protected.
So, a question from Bonnie. She's visited a few times. Was there a grandfather's clock in the hallway?
That's a great question and a very interesting one. That is, so the inquiry I get the most about, people will write to me and say, I have the exact duplicate to the original clock in Mount Vernon. A tall case clock is what they would have called it in the 18th century. And so, yes, until I believe the 1970s or early 1980s, there was a tall case clock that sat right there on the landing. And so there are many photos of that, and people do remember it. And it's one of these tall case clocks. It's really incredible. It's sort of a fairly plain model of a tall case clock. It's not very distinctive in any way, so it looks like a lot of other tall case clocks. So yes, that was actually here. There's no account of Washington ever owning a tall case clock. The only clock we know of him owning is the mantle clock that's in the Washington bedchamber that he gets during the presidency in the 1790s. But the reason it sits there is because there's a Longfellow poem in the 19th century about a grandfather clock sitting on a colonial mantelpiece. This is one of these Colonial Revival traditions that you see, and it's very evocative. So a lot of paintings of Mount Vernon and a lot of photos will show a wonderful tall case clock standing right there.
Can you actually elaborate on what Colonial Revival is?
Absolutely. So Colonial Revival is this period. Scholars disagree on when the Colonial Revival really starts, but a lot of people say it starts with 1876. With the 100th year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And it's this resurgence of interest in the young nation, in the founding era, and in the art and architecture of the country. So you see lots of people collecting, restoring antique houses, buying interiors out of antique houses and using them, putting them together into other houses, buying antiques, American antiques, and telling the stories about them. And so the Colonial Revival, with that traditional sort of 1876, it really continues on to this day with people who want sort of a colonial style home. There are less of those people today than there were maybe 20 years ago, but it's still an important taste and an important style in today's daily living.
So, question, Adam, what percentage of the furniture and artifacts in the mansion are original to the mansion?
That's a very good question, and it's one that's hard to answer. What percentage are original? And it's easier to talk about it in the sense of individual spaces that have lots of objects, original objects. Say the new room that's really furnished in 1797. A significant portion of the original objects are in there. The study, place so important to George Washington, also has a lot of original objects, as does the Washington bedchamber. So these emotionally charged spaces. But for the core of the house, a lot of these spaces have most spaces have a few original pieces, but a lot of the furniture in particular has been lost. For instance, the front parlor, all of the back stools, the chairs in there, and the sofa are reproductions based on the documentary evidence because the originals don't survive. And it really, the paintings in the front parlor, some are original. There are 3 originals, and then some are replicas because the originals are owned by other institutions. So it's hard to do a percentage, and the percentage can change based on how much china we bring in for a particular dining scenario. So it's different all the time.
So Adam, if David would like to know who did the architectural work in the rooms, and would they've installed or done work expanding the mansion, and what did materials of the room come from?
Okay, so I think the question there is about who did the architectural work. So the architectural design work in the 18th century would have been a combination of the owner of the house and the master builder he worked with, who was not quite an architect as we think of today, but they worked together, and Washington would point out in one pattern book, here's a plate I like, or the master builder might bring the pattern book to Washington, because Washington is not actually known to have owned any of the pattern books that he used. Brought it to him, and Washington made a selection, and then they cobbled these things together to create a structure. Washington himself was very much he had the drawing skills to execute details of the house. There's one fantastic drawing that survives when Washington's expanding the house in the 1770s, and he's drawing out how he wants the wings to appear. And he actually makes everything on the mansion circle side of the house look like it's evenly spaced, even though he's not able to actually achieve that. So it's really a combination of the workman doing the work and the person who owns the house figuring out how it works. The materials, there's a lot of wood in the house. There's a lot of plaster and glass. Glass is typically ordered from England. And in that period, and Washington sends massive orders to England for things like glass, nails. These are things that the British Empire is really good at producing. And they send those, Washington buys them in large quantities and uses them throughout the house.
So Adam, a question from Peg, was the central passage ever in a darker wood?
Was it ever in a dark? Yes. So it was painted faux grained to look like wood. And if you turn around, Matt, can you show her the door? It very much looked like this door here. That is faux graining. That's the same generation of faux graining, or not. It's the same kind of faux graining that you saw all around the room. That particular. Yes, so that's what we had in 1980. It was, to my knowledge, and from what I've ever seen, I don't think it's ever been finished wood. I think it's always been painted, and certainly during George Washington's life, it was always painted. I'm just looking at a detail that I'd like to point out that very few people actually see. And if you look above the doorway to the piazza, there's this wonderful little heart motif that comes out of one of the 18th century pattern books. The hearts sort of come in and touch each other in the center. It's a beautiful motif that people come through that door and never turn back around to look at it. So it's kind of a fun little detail. It's not on any of the others.
So Adam, a question from Sandy. How often do you rotate the paintings in and out of circulation?
Rotate the painting. So that's a good question. So for the prints, we tried for a long time to rotate these prints on a 6-month period. But the way Washington framed, we have several original Washington prints that survive in their original frames. And in the 18th century, you really could, when you buy editions of Washington's prints, you get them in all sorts of various sizes because they were printed on large folio sheets of paper like this one that you see here. Washington always framed his prints tight into this plate mark that you see right here. And so it's when we redo this space, we're going to introduce replicas that are duplicates of the period examples that are reproductions that will go up the staircase and be the exact size and exact profile, look exactly like George Washington's, so that we don't have this sort of uneven effect of different kinds of prints.
So a question from Riz. So are the colors of the paint in each room and the bedding what was originally in the house or an exact reproduction?
Okay, so yes, so it's very interesting, the colors in the house. Let's start with the dining room, which is really an incredible color. Washington actually has this room painted this verdigris green in the right when he comes back, I think, from the Revolution. This verdigris green, which is a very fashionable color. And this is one of the few where we have a written account that says Washington had it painted this color. And the reason he has it painted this color is because the Fairfaxes next door had their dining room painted. It was wallpapered in this particular color. And Washington, when they moved to England, bought their furniture and brought it to Mount Vernon. So he wanted to match with that furniture. But this was a very popular color in the period. Vertebra Green is the oxidation of copper that's put in linseed oil and made into a paint. And it continues to oxidize after it's put on the wall. So this is replicated, and you can see the wonderful how it would have aged with the wonderful brown streaks in that particular paint. It's a beautiful color. Washington likely kept it this way throughout the rest of his life. And so this is one that we know fairly well. But with each of these spaces, we're reanalyzing the paint analysis that's done, because unfortunately nothing survives except for a few of the back cubby spaces. Very little survives that has the original paint surface exposed. You have to take samples and look at the many different layers and figure out exactly what layer is original. And one aspect to point out about that I think is interesting is when we're doing this paint analysis, you take a sample, you put it under a microscope, and you get layers. It looks like a layer cake, and you have to figure out. Our mission is to show Mount Vernon in 1799, the last year of Washington's life. But Washington didn't just paint this space once. Which layer of paint did he end up on by 1799? And so we have to combine that evidence with documentary evidence and see how many times we think Washington painted an individual space to come up with the color that these spaces end up.
So, Adam, question from the Teacher Institute. How many people, free and enslaved, would have lived in the mansion?
To our knowledge, the people that lived in the mansion, the free people that lived in the mansion there's only one enslaved person living in the mansion, and that was Frank Lee, the enslaved butler. Frank Lee lived in the basement, and in the 18th century, there was a staircase between the butler's pantry and the basement, and Frank Lee used that because he would have been responsible, as I said, for answering the doors. He was the only enslaved person staying who lived in the house. The free people living in the house, it really varied with time, depending on which family members were here visiting the Washingtons. And then enslaved people would stay with various members of the Washington family when they were ill in different time periods. But again, that's a topic we're doing more research on every day, trying to figure out more, because references to enslaved people staying in the mansion are sometimes a little bit oblique, and you have to really ferret out the evidence and figure that out. But Washington also had a bell system installed in the house, and that was to call enslaved people from outside into the interior to whichever space he needed them in.
So Dario wants to know, how old is the house?
How old is the house? That's a good question. And that question has been debated for many, many generations. And luckily, we have a definitive bit of evidence, few definitive bits of evidence nowadays. Technology has really helped us with that, because the Washingtons had this property from the 1670s. There are earlier elements of the house, like the famous L.W. stone that you see on National Trust Book of Secrets, National Treasures Book of Secrets. So the L.W. stone, that's certainly of a very much earlier date than the house. The house actually dates to 1734, when it was built by George Washington's father, Augustine Washington, and his wife, Mary Ball. We did some dendrochronology on the house, probably late 90s, early 2000s, and that's tree ring dating, where you look at a piece of wood in the house that you think to be original, and you hope that the piece survives out to the bark layer, and you figure out when that tree was felled. And the trees, there was 1734 is when the house was built. Recently, we've had a wonderful new discovery. There is a fireback at the DAR Museum in Washington, D.C. that has the initials on the back AMW in the year 1734. This fireback was found at a neighboring plantation that belonged to a man named Lund Washington. Lund Washington was here at Mount Vernon in the 1780s, overseeing when Washington took out his firebacks and put in new firebacks. So he would have been, this was found in the ruins of his house. He would have been first up to get some of these things. So what we think it is a fireback that's saying Augustine and Mary Ball Washington, 1734, the year that it was built. And that really is an important artifact because it was also likely made in Augustine's furnace, the Principio furnace, which is very cool.
So Adam, a question from Lori. What did the wallpaper look like?
It's sort of a hard wallpaper to describe. It's long sort of panels of scenes, and the panels go, there's say a flower basket, and then there are vines or sort of spandrels that go down and connect the next element, which could be a trophy, some sort of ancient trophy. And then you go down a little bit more and you've got an ancient figure. It's really beautiful. I'm not describing it very well. It's very beautiful, but if you Google arabesque wallpaper, you'll find exactly what I'm talking about.
And Emily would like to know, how difficult was it to find original objects that belonged to were in here at Mount Vernon? That's
a good question. It is difficult. It's interesting because there are lots of people, and we always encourage people to write in and ask us if you have something that you think belonged to George and Martha Washington. Please write in and let us know. We spend a lot of time researching each of these inquiries and figuring out could that actually be true? In a lot of instances it's not, but in some instances it turns out to be. There are a lot in 1802. Martha Washington had an estate. There was an estate sale after Martha's death, and all of the furnishings were dispersed at that point that weren't specifically given away in the will. Lots of them, the Custis family, her grandchildren, have first dibs on those objects. So the vast majority of objects that survive today came down in the Custis family. So that's one really helpful hint to figure out if it is original. We found things that come through different lines. One wonderful porcelain figure that belonged on the presidential dining table actually descended from an enslaved woman who was here, a woman named Delphi Judge, or Philadelphia Judge. It came down through she and her husband, William Costin. It was sold in the 19th century to a collector in New York State. And I got an inquiry a few years ago about a chair that purportedly belonged to George Washington. And they also had this porcelain figure, and it was right as rain. And it was an incredible new discovery. So they come from all sorts of different places, but usually you'll have a few good finds a year.
So Adam, a question from Dominic. Do you ever look for any new artifacts in the home?
Absolutely. I got a good example of that. This table over here. So when we did a lot of work on the new room, we knew dining took place in the new room. I was trying to figure out what sort of dining tables would have been used in the space. And so I reconstructed basically what the accounts were for George Washington purchasing dining tables over the years. And we found out that Washington in 1757 had bought a pair of dining tables, mahogany dining tables that were 4.5 feet square. This is one table. There were two that went together. The other one is in the dining room. Bought a pair of dining tables that he used throughout the rest of his life. In the 1790s, Washington needed to be able to accommodate more people. So he had the enslaved carpenters here on the estate build a third leaf for a dining table or another table to go in between. So Washington's dining tables were purchased by George Washington Parke Custis. They didn't survive to this day. So I worked with a few antiques dealers in the UK to track down these dining tables, which meet the specifications fairly specifically. And so we were able to purchase those. They're not Washington originals, but they're very much like what he had.
That's the same as in here, right?
Yes, that's the same. So that one's in here. And it also shows labor, the way we have it arranged in the space. So we have one out here in the central passage, not being used, because you could have set the dining tables up however you needed them. In this space, you have the dining table set up, and it's just one half of the dining table. So you have one half and you can put them together and use the two, or you could put them all three together and use three in the 1790s.
Is that a floor cloth in the dining room?
That is a floor cloth, which would have been very common in the 18th century to use in a dining room, because floor cloths are made of canvas. It's then painted. The paint is very hard wearing. There's several layers of paint on there, and then it's easy to clean off. So floor cloths were very much used, and you can have, it really brightens up a room. You can add a variety of different prints on it. And so we do, in some of Martha Washington's estate accounts, we do know that there are floor cloths that are used in these in the spaces. So we interpreted one in there.
And Brandon would like to know, does the main house at Mount Vernon have restrooms?
That's a good question. No, the house does not have restrooms. In the 18th century, they would have used chamber pots that would have been taken out by enslaved housemaids, which are little pots that would have been in a variety of different rooms, bedchambers, and other spaces. Would have been taken out by enslaved people and dumped. There are also privies or outhouses up until, I believe, the 1790s. I may be wrong about the exact date. There was at least one privy on the outside, on the riverside, and there are two that look like little seed houses on either side of the upper and lower garden. So they're at this end, at the other side are the seed houses. So yes, that's how they either had to go outside or they had to use a chamber pot in the 18th century.
And Adam, Cynthia would like to know, are the floors in the house original to the house? And could you also maybe talk about how George Washington supervised the construction while he was away at war?
Absolutely. So the floors in the house are various states of original. They're original in the new room. Lots of the second floor, the floors are original, and I believe the study is also original. The central core of the house, on the first floor, I believe most of them have been replaced. Those are really important. Yeah, so the floors that you have most of the floors are southern yellow pine, which is what you see in a lot of these Virginia houses. During the wars, during the presidency, Washington, while he was away, he really supervised the construction of the houses of the house. And that's really lucky for us that he was away, because we have all the wonderful letters that he writes back to his various estate, the people who are managing his household for him or helping him out, explaining exactly what he wants. So it helps us think through what he's done. In the 1750s, Washington is gone during the French and Indian War. So he's writing back here, and George William Fairfax in neighboring Belvoir is overseeing a lot of what's going on. So Washington is writing to him. And then during the American Revolution, Washington has just added the South Wing, working on the South Wing, is redoing the dining room and is adding the new room. And he's writing back from the siege of Boston saying to his farm manager, could please put a roof onto the new room, which is really, really remarkable. So in these moments of stress, Washington's able to mentally escape to Mount Vernon and sort of think through his projects, what he's got going on, which I think is really remarkable about him.
So, Adam, a question from Roger: is the basement or attic off limits? And if so, what's in them?
Okay, the basement and attic, or the third floor, are not off limits. The third floor is technically right now not on tour because we just finished up putting a major fire suppression system in the house. The basement is but ordinarily it is open for tours. On the third floor, you have the Martha Washington Bedchamber, which is where Martha moved in 1799 after George's death. She moved to the third floor because she didn't want to go back in the Washington Bedchamber. There's a china closet up there, which I think is really interesting. That's where the really expensive ceramics were kept. They call it the sweetmeat closet in the period. And I think that's probably also where the silver was, kept under lock and key, but the Washingtons had enough enslaved people to bring them between the floors and make sure that they're not broken. There are also storage rooms, another couple of bed chambers up there. In the basement, there are a lot of storage spaces, but there's also a servants' hall and Franklin's bedchamber. And the servants' hall would have been, Washington always talks about he has two dining tables. So presumably the more elite sort of hired servants or indentured white servants would have taken their meals also from the kitchen in the servants' hall, and that's underneath Washington's study. So that's another really important space. But yes, you can. Those are both things that you can tour. If you're here on the state map, what's the tour called?
The National Treasure Tour.
The National Treasure Tour. You can tour it down in the basement.
So, Adam, probably just time for two more questions.
Okay.
Lori would like to know, what's your favorite room?
What's my favorite room? Okay, that's a good question because people have heard me talk about. I've been working on for the last 6 years. I've been working on the front parlor. The front parlor is not my favorite room. My favorite room is actually the dining room. I think the dining room is the most sort of interesting aesthetically space. You have wonderful carving that's done by an English carver, William Bernard Sears. The plasterwork ceiling is really the most remarkable of the ones here at Mount Vernon, the best surviving, and I really love the green color. To me, that's my favorite space.
And one more question. Within recent history, what has been the most surprising discovery within the mansion?
The most surprising discovery within the mansion within recent history. Well, I mean, in my mind, the most surprising discovery was that account book because it really, from a curatorial standpoint, there are elements of that Fairfax furniture that are used in multiple spaces. And so, whereas before we didn't exactly understand what the colors were on textiles and those sorts of things, this gives incredible explicit detail. So we know that this room had Saxon blue furniture, which was this bright blue, and that completely changes the aesthetic of the room. We know that the little parlor had a settee bedstead that pulls out into a bed. It had Saxon green upholstery, and the Saxon green upholstery is this bright emerald green color. So that really sort of frames that room in a really wonderful way. And then this room, the dining room, had chairs that had crimson upholstery, which was a bright red color. So those aspects just came out in this document, and they will inform our restorations for probably the next 20 or 30 years. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's been a pleasure to give you a tour and actually to be back in the mansion for a little bit of time, talk a little bit about your questions, and I look forward to doing this again sometime soon. Thank you so much.